Imagine a society taken over by corruption, where humans look for contact with heavenly beings and homes fall apart. It's in this setting that Lot appears, a man pushed into the center of events that will mark the end of an entire city. When he chooses to live near Sodom, he has no idea of the price of that decision or the impact it will have on his daughters. The judgment that's coming is intense. Nothing and no one goes unnoticed. So go ahead and leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. Stay with me to understand why Lot's daughters slept with their own father and what this story still reveals about us. Lot's story appears in Genesis as a parallel thread to Abraham's, revealing the kind of life that grows out of faith in God's promises. Lot enters the scene when his family leaves Ur of the Chaldeans and heads to Haran. Orphaned of his father, he begins walking alongside his grandfather and his uncle Abraham. After Terah's death, the family starts moving again, now toward Canaan, and Lot decides to stay with Abraham, sharing risks and hopes. When famine hits the land, the two of them go down to Egypt in search of survival. There, a misunderstanding involving Pharaoh ends with Abraham and Sarai being forced to leave, and Lot returns with them to Canaan. Despite the tensions, this period marks material growth for both. Their herds increase, their servants multiply, and the land that once seemed enough becomes too small for the two clans. The shepherds of Abraham and Lot get into conflict, revealing that abundance can also expose the heart. It's at this point that the contrast between the two becomes clearer. Abraham responds to challenges with trust in God and a willingness to give up what might look like an advantage at first. Instead of fighting for the best part of the land, he gives Lot the right to choose first, showing that his security isn't in fertile fields, but in the promises he received. Lot, on the other hand, seems guided by what he sees, drawn to the immediate opportunities in front of him. Sitting at the entrance of his tent under the oaks of Mamre, Abraham looks up and sees 3 men approaching in silence. Without hesitating, he runs to meet them, bows to the ground as a sign of deep respect, and urges them to stay. He asks them to rest in the shade, has water brought so they can wash their tired feet, and orders fresh bread and the best of the meal to be prepared so they can regain their strength before continuing their journey. While they eat, the atmosphere changes. This isn't just an ordinary visit. One of the men declares that the following year, at that same time, Sarah would have a son, even though old age already weighed heavily on her shoulders. The promise echoes the word Abraham had heard before about an uncountable offspring, as numerous as the stars in the sky. The scene reveals a God who draws near, sits at the table, and speaks with his servant as someone very close, sharing the daily life of the tent and the family. In contrast, Lot lets himself be drawn in by the offers of a world that seems advantageous. Tempted by fertile land and promises of quick progress, and his choices end up separating their paths, leading uncle and nephew to follow different directions. At the moment when the tension between the herdsmen started to grow, Abraham took the initiative to prevent the conflict from taking root. Instead of fighting over territory, he called Lot for an honest conversation and calmly suggested they separate. Generously, he gave his nephew the right to choose first which region he wanted to live in, showing that his trust wasn't in the land but in God. Lot lifted his eyes and saw the plains of the Jordan, green and well-watered, stretching toward the Dead Sea near Sodom. Drawn in by what looked like an immediate advantage, he decided to head in that direction, guided more by what he saw than by spiritual discernment. Abraham stayed where he was, while Lot moved closer and closer to Sodom until he settled there and gained influence among its people. But the wickedness of that population was intense, and the constant injustice and violence weighed on him day after day, eating away at his peace. It was in this setting that a coalition of kings invaded the region, defeated Sodom and the surrounding cities, and carried off goods, people, and prisoners, including Lot himself. The sudden fall of the city revealed how much that choice, which had seemed so promising, hid dangers he had never considered. When Abraham hears about Lot's kidnapping, he gathers a small group of trained men and, under the cover of night, moves against the enemy kings. The attack is quick, catches the opposing army by surprise, and results in the rescue of Lot, his family, and all the goods that were taken. It's on the way back that Abraham meets Melchizedek, a mysterious figure who blesses the patriarch and points to God's quiet work in the middle of the conflict. Even after the war that nearly destroyed Sodom, Lot insists on staying there. The story then shifts to a new scene, the arrival of angels in the city, now overtaken by disorder and corruption. God's presence in a place so marked by evil shows his attention to the cry of injustice, echoing the message of Jeremiah 23:24. The Lord decides to examine up close the sin of Sodom and make his justice clear. When the angels enter the city, the wickedness of its people shows itself without disguise. The men surround Lot's house and demand access to the visitors, ready to assault them. It's a harsh picture of the moral blindness of that population, and one of the reasons for the judgment that's coming. In the middle of the chaos, Lot tries to stop the crowd by offering his own daughters, an action that exposes his weakness and how the atmosphere of Sodom had twisted his sense of right and wrong. At this point in the biblical narrative, we see Abraham draw near to God in an intense conversation driven by the news of Sodom's destruction. He doesn't passively accept the announced judgment. Instead, he intercedes, asks questions, and thinks about the fate of the righteous living among the wicked. His dialogue with the Lord echoes James 5:16, which says that the prayer of a righteous person is effective and produces real results. With each question, Abraham seems to test the limits of divine mercy, lowering the number of righteous people needed for the city to be spared. This movement reveals the trust he has in God's character, a God described in Psalm 86:15 as compassionate, patient, and faithful in his love. At the same time, the story shows that this mercy isn't abstract. When the moment of judgment comes upon the cities of the plain, 2 angels are sent to bring Lot and his family out of Sodom. Their rescue points to a God who takes both justice and his covenant with Abraham seriously, setting the stage for everything that's about to be revealed next. And as we follow this bold negotiation, we're invited to reflect on how our own intercession can align with that same justice, opening the way for the next step of this journey. When the men of Sodom surrounded Lot's house to forcefully take the visitors, the angels stopped the violence, striking the crowd with blindness and giving a direct command. Lot was to gather his family and leave the city under judgment. Even then, he hesitated. He almost had to be pulled out, showing how attached he still was to that place. In the urgency of their escape, the instruction was clear: don't look back. Still, Lot's wife crossed that line, and when she turned her eyes toward Sodom, she was turned into a pillar of salt. That image reflects our tendency to keep looking at what God has already declared condemned. Lot's wife becomes a symbol of the weight of choices and the danger of treating as optional what God sets as a boundary. Lot survived, but he also experienced the consequences of his decisions. By choosing to live near Sodom, he exposed his home to an environment that eroded values and blurred the line between faith and cultural habits. That tension echoes in Christians today, surrounded by standards that seem normal but clash with biblical teaching. After escaping, Lot and his daughters don't breathe a sigh of relief. Afraid, they seek shelter in a small town and soon hide in a cave in the mountains. This act shows how they still struggled to trust in God's care, in contrast to Abraham, who walked without knowing the details but kept trusting. The cave, more than physical shelter, exposes the urge to retreat inward and build emotional and spiritual walls when reality feels threatening. When we think about how trauma can shape a person, The story of Lot and his daughters becomes a disturbing example. After the destruction of Sodom, isolated in a cave and believing there was no future beyond that situation, the young women began to fear for their own survival and for the continuation of their family. Seeing no alternatives and overwhelmed by despair, they decided to get their father drunk on different nights and sleep with him in an attempt to produce descendants. From this came Moab and Ben-Ami, ancestors of the Moabites and the Ammonites, peoples who would later face Israel in various conflicts. The biblical narrative shows how this choice, filled with moral confusion, left deep marks, not only on history, but also on their relationship with Lot and on how he is remembered. Interestingly, after these events, almost nothing else is said about him. We don't know if he rebuilt his life, if he found any kind of peace, or if he stayed in the mountains until the end. Even so, centuries later, the Apostle Peter mentions Lot again in his second letter, recalling the judgment over Sodom and Gomorrah and the way God rescued him from that scene of destruction, once more linking his story to the themes of judgment, trauma, and survival. In the New Testament, Jesus mentions Lot in Luke when talking about the final days. He recalls the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot's rescue as a warning sign. Many were caught by surprise back then, and many can be caught by surprise again. That's why readiness and obedience to God are priorities for anyone who wants to stay firm. Lot lived alongside Abraham, the father of faith, and saw up close what it means to trust God. Even so, he chose to follow a different path. Instead of listening to the Lord's direction, he let himself be guided by what looked advantageous in the cities of the plain. His decisions didn't affect only his own story, but also his household, showing the weight of choices shaped by personal desires. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah still speaks to Christians today. In Romans 12:2, Paul instructs believers not to conform to this age, but to be transformed by the renewing of the mind. Faith in Christ calls for a different posture, one that doesn't copy the patterns around us, but seeks to discern God's will amid daily pressures. Lot's life leads us to ask where we've been planting our feet and which voices have been guiding our steps. May this reflection help you review your choices and seek in God direction for the next step. If this message spoke to your heart, share it with someone who needs this reminder. May the Lord bless your life and strengthen your faith today and always.